psychic spies, Cold War whimsy, or secret weapon. Some people may have certain psychic powers. This may reassure you, it may alarm you, but in fact, for some years now, the U.S. intelligence community has wagered a modest amount of money on the possibility that such powers do exist. Such powers do exist.
My name is Russell Targ, and I'm a physicist. The more attention you place on hiding something, the more it shines like a beacon in psychic space.
If I have a document on my desk that I consider highly sensitive and classified, that there could be some Russian psychic 1,000 miles away reproducing what I'm looking at.
One time we had a small plane go down somewhere in Africa, and we were not able to find it by surveillance. So the director of the CIA heard about a woman in California that was a medium or something. I don't know the title for. And she gave him the latitude and longitude of the plane's whereabouts. We located the plane where she said it was. And that's the only time that I have ever experienced something that was inexplicable while I was present.
The first series of experiments here at Stanford Research Institute were what the scientists called remote viewing.
You can actually take out of thin air information about something you have absolutely no access to, just using your mind.
In Pat Price's drawings, it was as if it was from inside his brain.
It was obvious to any intelligence organization that if you had an ability to be able to remotely perceive stuff, really remotely, like any place in the world, that could be an extraordinary intelligence source.
For more than 20 years, the CIA used psychic abilities operationally and in a top secret program for the U.S. government. You paid for them, you deserve to see them.
Back in 1972, SRI was primarily a contractor for the government and some industry. The Russians have been spending millions of dollars over a decade at some of their best institutes investigating so-called ESP. No scientists in America even believe there's such a thing as ESP. As we were doing these experiments, we began to run into flack from the psychologists at SRI. They said, you know, you've got that crazy ESP experiments going on. That's going to ruin our reputation. We're going to lose our fund and get rid of those guys.
The Scan8 program was started by Ingo Swann, and in that program, where we were using coordinate remote viewing, a viewer described what was located at any geographical coordinate of latitude and longitude, and would then describe what's there.
So it was over the telephone, saying, you know, I used to be maybe police commissioner or something like that in Burbank, and sometimes I would get intuitive flashes about some crime scene that we were working on, and it would turn out I would be right. Maybe I should be a subject.
SRI comes up with Pat Price.
We sat down with our coffee, and I said, here's the target, Pat. What do you see?
Next morning, they came back with a sketch.
And we showed him the picture.
So I go over and I say, well, I've got this science fiction fantasy crane.
And he unrolled a big picture of an R&D facility, and right in the middle of this facility was a photograph of a giant gantry crane.
From the sketch from the photographic image. He said, oh, this was a huge crane. He said, I saw somebody walk by and the guy only came up to the axle or something on the wheels, or up to the top of the wheels. Pat, what do you see about underground?
He said, one of the big things they're doing here is making these 60-foot spheres out of steel. They're actually 58 feet.
they finally rolled out a 60-foot diameter steel sphere that's part of a containment vessel for a particle beam weapon to shoot down American surveillance satellites. Exactly what Price described.
We once found a guy that could see anywhere in the world through his psychic powers. We could show him a picture of any place and he could describe any activity going on there. But he died, and we haven't heard from him since. CIA Director Stansfield Turner, Chicago Tribune, August 1977.
Even though he died unattended in a hotel room, you don't need to make it a medical examiner case, although that's not correct. And he was taken to the emergency room, which I visited. Speaking now as a criminologist, I would have investigated the hell out of it.
Everybody knew that there had to be some foundational science or this stuff would never be accepted.
Stanford Research Institute has been conducting an experimental program in the field of psychoenergetic effect.
I had Hal and Russ bring Uri Geller to me, who was supposedly one of the psychokinetic people who could take and bend setups.
15 drawings were placed in double-sealed envelopes in a safe for which none of the experimenters had the combination. This is Geller's representation of what he believed was sealed in the envelope. This is the most off-target of the drawings that he did. As you can see, he is quite elated about getting the right answer.
Chief Warrant Officer Joe McMonagle.
The Stanford Art Museum was Joe McMonagle's first ever remote viewing. We then did 5 more trials with him. Altogether, we did 36 trials with the 6 Army volunteers. Out of the 36 trials, these officers were able to get 19 first-place matches, where one would expect only 6 by chance. The odds of such an excellent result is better than 1 in a million.
Contained critical intelligence reported at the highest echelons of our military and government, including such national-level agencies as the Joint Chiefs of Staff, DIA, NSA, CIA, DEA, and the Secret Service, producing crucial and vital intelligence unavailable from any other source.
October 11th, 1974. It's 20 minutes to 4 in the afternoon. Russ Targ and Hella Hammond are in the First Royal Laboratory at SRI. Hal has left SRI. He will select a randomly chosen destination.
Hal is looking up at this structure that must be 3-4 stories high. A weird zigzag going horizontally like a series of mountains, sort of peaks on top of each other, can be just shapes. The side of the structure seems to be open to the sky too. Squares within squares within squares, going downward like into a trough. It's definitely some kind of a conduit.
This is just where Hal Puthoff was standing at the time of Hella Hammond's very first remote viewing.
This kind of thing happens in art. I believe, and always have believed, and I've returned to it many times in my life, that I am not this body in terms of consciousness, and consciousness can go places where the body cannot.
We went to the CIA handlers and we said, look, you've got to let us publish some of these experiments. Everyone's beginning to say, well, gee, maybe it's a secret program. So anyway, we got their permission to put together a series of our Bay Area remote viewing experiments and publish them.
Perhaps the most dangerous secret of all, the one that Russell Targ has worked his whole life to release, is that anybody can be psychic.
And we have a target now that requires a drawing or description. So I'd like you to quiet your mind and make a little sketch of the surprising images that show up in your awareness. want to get on paper the shape and the form pertaining to Paul's location.
I think it's still a question of what it means to be really human and what it means to be a proper human being, whatever that might mean, and what is the essence of who we are. And I think that if the world actually had an access to that answer, I think it would change everything.
Welcome to the Richard Dolan Show, where every week we fight the good fight. Greetings. My guest for this program is someone, this is one of the classic cases of someone who needs no introduction, but you know, there's always new people coming into the conversation, so I think Russell Targ deserves a decent introduction, despite the fact that he's a legend in his field. Russell Targ is a physicist, he's an author, he's a pioneer in the development of the laser and laser applications, but I would have to say he's most famous for his work with Stanford Research Institute, SRI, where he was the co-founder of SRI's investigation of psychic abilities in the 1970s and 80s. And we talk about remote viewing. It's now part of our lexicon, and Russell Targ is arguably the key person in bringing the study of remote viewing into the U.S. intelligence community. We can talk about that, but he's done it all. He's known everyone. He's worked with Dr. Hal Puthoff. He's worked with Ingo Swann, Joe McMoneagle, Pat Price, many others, and they've created something that is now part of a legacy. Most recently, Russell is the subject of the upcoming movie called Third Eye Spies, and this is a documentary treatment of the remote viewing subject. It's very good. Tracy and I watched it, and we're going to get to talk about that. So without any further ado, without any further waiting, Russell, thank you so very much for being here.
I'm very happy to be with you. I have a chance to talk to you about my favorite subject.
Well, I can tell you, it's one of my favorite subjects. I've been fascinated with remote viewing myself for many years. When I started researching UFOs, I quickly discovered, wow, who are these remote viewers and why are they running into extraterrestrials and UFOs all the time? So that prompted my interest, but it's much, much bigger than just looking for ET, that's for sure. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about, well, you know, you brought this into SRI in the early 70s. I'm aware that you've had prior interest in this type of phenomenon, but you helped develop remote viewing. You helped to develop the protocols for doing remote viewing. And, you know, as I think, there's always new people coming into the conversation. So I just wonder if you might be able to explain to them what the heck this is, what's this all about, and how does it work, and what was your role in it?
Well, what you and I are talking about is the true story of CIA psychic spying. That's what brings us together now. I had a lifetime interest from childhood in psychic abilities. I was a very good card player, anomalously good card player. And by the time I was a teenager, it became clear to me that there's a little ESP floating around that's available. And I did psychic stuff on the stage, pretending to read minds. And what I encountered personally is that from time to time, images would come to me while I was standing with the lights in my eyes, and those images might correspond to the person whose mind I was pretending to read. And as the magicians would say, I talked to Melbourne Christopher and the great Kreskin, and they said, oh yes, we can supplement our tricks with whatever ESP comes our way. And I was doing that, but by the time I got to college, I quit doing magic on the stage and began to read the journals of the American Society for Psychical Research and so forth, and they were in New York City. So I could hang out at the ASPR headquarters and talk to other researchers, and I began to do experiments myself. That I built an ESP teaching machine, which is a 4-choice trainer that lets you get in touch with the part of yourself that's psychic. And that game is now online, called ESP Trainer, and it's a free app that I've made available.
I need to try that. I know you've talked about this with a few other folks who have said that they've tried it and they seem to like it. So that's on my agenda.
Yeah, people write to me and say, I'm getting 12 out of 24, what does that mean? And I said, that means that you're doing statistically significant runs each time you do that, and try and figure out what it feels like so you can recognize in your life when you're having a psychic experience rather than memory and imagination and wish fulfillment.
And you're getting immediate feedback, which obviously I've learned is very important for people in this process, right? Getting that feedback.
And the one other important part of that game is if you don't have that special feeling, you can press the pass button. It'll show you the correct answer and won't charge you for the trial. So this is not to measure your ESP. This is to help you get in touch with the part of yourself that's psychic, and that's why I call it a teaching machine.
I think this seems like a unique invention or a unique thing to provide for people. I'm not aware of anything else like this.
No, this was I developed this in 1965 when I was making high-power lasers at Sylvania. Off to the side, I built this ESP, four-choice ESP game, and so that's now a 50-year-old game, and it's still, and now it's a free app.
Yeah, well, technology's caught up to your idea, so you're actually able to implement it on a wide scale, which is really neat. Can you talk a little bit about the early days at SRI and particularly how you helped to develop the methodology for doing this? I know there were very excellent psychics like Ingo Swann who came in, and a little shortly later, Pat Price. I would really love to hear about both of them. But you really worked out how to do this process. And I don't want to lead you here, but I feel like it's a very important thing. You've stressed this many times, and other remote viewers have said, you got to shut down the conscious mind, the analytical mind as much as possible. And I know this was a big part of what you learned in those early years.
Well, in the beginning, I was doing what a physicist would do. I would say to Ingo, we got a box here. Can you tell me if the laser is turned on or turned off? Here's an envelope. Can you tell me about the picture in the envelope? And Ingo said, you're wasting my time. I can focus my attention anywhere at the planet. If I want to see what's in the envelope, I'll open the envelope. What I think you should let me do is have someone hide someplace in the San Francisco Bay Area, and I'll describe what they're doing and what it looks like. So within 2 weeks of assembling the program at SRI, Ingo had invented remote viewing in the modern era and saved us from reinventing card guessing.
Yeah.
So Ingo is the one who said, we should go back to experiments where you don't have to guess up or down, clubs or spades. Just quiet your mind and describe the surprising images that come into your awareness. And that's what I did for a decade at SRI. I help people get away from guessing and naming and describe the images they had. So I had to say a word about remote viewing is what we're talking about. And remote viewing is an ability that we all have to a greater or lesser degree that allows you to see and experience what's going on in the distance, what's going on in the future. And this is a non-local ability. So modern physics has finally caught up with psychic functioning. The non-locality is the hot topic in modern science, as you probably know. The photons born together stay together even though they travel at the speed of light across the universe. They still notice if you grab my twin across the universe, I will notice that. And that's true for people, and it's true for twin photons, entangled photons. Mm-hmm. And Schrödinger talked about this in the late 1920s, that he said entanglement is the unique aspect of quantum physics. It's not something we observe, it's the unique, important part of it.
Well, you're prompting me to jump the gun here. I wanted to ask about some of the really interesting remote viewing stories, but I would just like to ask you now, because this has been on my mind, is the physics of all of this. Like, in other words, the things that remote viewers have been demonstrated to be able to do, and I know we'll talk a little bit about it, some of Ingo's experiments, Pat Price, Joe McMoneagle, Helga Hammett, and many others, these are things that are not supposed to be possible with our previous conventional understanding of physics. Like I would think it shouldn't be possible for, I don't know, someone like Joe McMoneagle to be able to remote view the newest Soviet submarine back in the 1970s that nobody knew about, and that he was able to provide pretty decent technical specifications of, and yet he did it. But then even crazier is remote viewing across time. Like, so I just wonder, like you, Hal Puthoff and others involved, you must have gone through your own process of thinking, my God, what are the physics that allow this to happen?
Well, the most important thing to realize is that we're not violating the laws of physics, which is impossible. You can't violate the laws of physics because they are laws. What we would say is that there's more going on than physicists have noticed. That is, we misunderstand the nature of the space-time we live in. And that's not bad. Physics has changed significantly every 50 years. Some new revolution. We went from Maxwell and to Planck to Einstein to quantum physics. All of these are giant jumps overturning what came before. So if we have a phenomenon that requires new physics or an addition to physics, nobody's going to be shocked by that. The reason I call what we're doing a non-local ability is the most important thing that I can tell you here is that it's no harder to describe what's going on in Soviet Russia for me sitting here in California. Describing something 6,000 miles away is no more difficult than describing what's going on at Stanford football stadium. And even more interesting, describing what you're going to do this evening, even though you haven't decided yet. It's a random factor. Your phone may still ring with a better offer. It's no harder to describe the random event in your future than it is to describe what's on your coffee table in your house. So the point of the precognition is just more of describing what's happening in space-time. And there's a model, which we call the 8-space model, that I developed with physicist Elizabeth Rauscher, that in a nutshell says we generally have 4 space-time dimensions, as you know. There's 4 space dimensions and a time dimension. However, all the way back in the time of Minkowski, 1900, he had developed a complex space-time, where each of these familiar distance and time is a complex number. That is, it has a real and imaginary part. We are not adding dimensions to physics. We're not saying there are 4 dimensions in modern physics. We think we should add another one. We're not doing that. We're saying there are 4 dimensions in physics that we work quite well. And what we've noticed is that in some instances, like describing electromagnetic fields and describing ESP, if those dimensions were each complex numbers with a real and imaginary part, then you would be able to travel with your consciousness through space-time, and there would be no distance between you and the thing you're describing. That is to say, there is always a path through the 8-dimensional manifold that has no distance. In fact, because it's 8-dimensional, there's an infinite number of paths. That is, if you're hiding something on your desk that I can't see, there's an infinite number of paths that my awareness can take to describe your thing. And that does not require any weird physics. It just points out that, in fact, Einstein couldn't solve the equations for relativity in 1905 because he was not a great mathematician. He was great at other things, but Minkowski helped him, and Minkowski gave Einstein the complex space-time that we use today in all of relativity. And Einstein said, I will keep this complex time number. So we can call the spatial dimensions X, Y, and Z, but I will keep multiplying time by the square root of -1 and the speed of light. Then I have 4 dimensions, one of which happens to be imaginary, and that'll work fine for me. So the idea of saying some of these dimensions should be complex is not new, it's not bizarre, it's not even modern.
I think about 1% of the people listening will understand that, and I cannot consider myself one of those 1% either, by the way. But are you suggesting that, at least it seems to me that one of the elements of the structure of our universe that hadn't really been perceived is consciousness itself? Is that part of the way you're thinking, or am I going in the wrong direction here?
Oh, I wouldn't say that. I mean, I'm a fairly unreconstructed logical positivist.
Okay.
That is, I don't think it's necessary to burn the believers anymore, but I think that data is really necessary before we spend time figuring things out. So yes, the universe may be full of consciousness. Buddhists certainly believe that. A lot of other people believe it. No known way to demonstrate that one way or another. And we've got a boatload of data here. I think we ought to talk about the things that are really true. The fact that our awareness is independent of space and time, that's pretty exciting.
Yes, indeed.
That we have a kind of timeless awareness or direct knowing, so that people are able to describe and experience anything that's happening on the planet, and demonstrated by Ingo Swann, even things that are far off the planet. We were once visited by NASA contract monitors. NASA supported the Stanford development of my ESP game. I did that, a formal experiment for NASA, so that astronauts could get in touch with their spacecraft, was the cover story for that. And I had
interesting.
I had NASA administrators visiting from time to time to see how that was going. And one time in 1974, a NASA administrator said, we're about to launch the Pioneer spacecraft to Jupiter, Ingo. Can you tell us, is there anything interesting that we'll find in Jupiter? Ingo sat back in his chair and took a puff of his cigar and said, well, they're all the big fat ring around Jupiter, and it's made of ice crystals. And my friend from George Pezner, the NASA administrator, said, no, Ingo, you're thinking of Saturn.
Right.
Ingo is very offended. Ingo said, I've been doing this for 50 years. You just have to believe I know the difference between Jupiter and Saturn. I'm looking at this giant Saturn, and there's a ring of ice crystals around it. When your spacecraft gets there, then you can call me and tell me that you've got pictures of the things I'm describing. And I have a recent book called The Reality of ESP, which describes all the work we did at SRI, which used to be classified, is now unclassified, and I have pictures of Ingo's drawings of the ring around Jupiter together with NASA's photograph. So that answers the question, are you limited to terrestrial viewing? And the answer is no. Ingo was able to look 500 million miles away, and that required no time. To the interesting,
that's extraordinary.
George could say, what's going on at Jupiter? Ingo could look up from this cloud of cigar smoke, and I say, well, it's interesting. There's a big fat ring around the planet. It did not take an hour for the signal to get from Jupiter,
right.
His
faster
awareness,
than light awareness. It sounds like
it's like faster than light, but if there's no separation, then there's no distance. See, in the Buddhist lore and the Prajnaparamita 2,500 years ago, the Buddha never tired of saying that separation is an illusion.
in consciousness, there is only one consciousness. And Schrodinger said that in 1920, that consciousness is a singular of which there is no plural. There's only one consciousness. So many people have thought that.
I want to ask about Pat Price and some of the other things that come into the documentary, but before I do, you're just prompting me. Do you have thoughts on the survival of consciousness after the physical death of the body? And I'm only asking because it seems to me that with the non-locality of consciousness, the fact that people are able to see across space and across time, that there's a part of us that seems, at least to me, to be able to leave this body of ours. And, ancient people had a word for it. They called it the soul. I don't know what your thoughts are on this. Do you think that there is any evidence that this is a consciousness that is independent of our bodies? And if it is independent of our bodies, could it survive the death of our bodies in some form?
Well, the evidence is very strong that the personality of some deceased people is able to communicate with living people. Whether it's a soul or not is a more complicated story, but there is no doubt in my mind, and I have personal experiences, where somebody who has died many years ago is able to send a message to the living. In fact, I had that experience with my darling daughter, who's a very intelligent psychiatrist. She died at age 40, and during a formal meeting among other people that I was not involved with whatsoever, my daughter Elizabeth said to one of the people, "Please give a message to my father and tell him about something that occurred to me in my early childhood. And if you tell him that, he will then be convinced that my consciousness survives, because no living person knows about that." And that was correct. That is, my friend told me about that whole experience, how Elizabeth popped into a business meeting, gave that message. My friend told me, I don't know what that pertains to, but Elizabeth said, you would know about it. And indeed, I could then debrief my friend and tell her about the calamity of early child training or child rearing that my young wife and I had, where we had this crying baby and didn't know what to do with her.
All right.
But turned out
the story of many new parents.
That's right. Many new parents don't know what the hell they're doing.
Nope.
We didn't abuse her. We were just stuffing her into a dress to please her grandmother, and she wasn't having any of that. She had never been in a dress before, and it was a mistake for us. It turned out to be a trauma for her, but who knew?
Golly.
But the purpose of that whole event is so that 40 years later, Elizabeth could send me a message making it clear to me that whole bizarre thing could be transmitted back. She had been deceased at least 5 or 6 years.
Wow.
By the time I got that message.
It's quite fascinating. I think many people...
So I'm a believer. I think
I'll be honest with you. So am I. I think many of us have such stories. I have such a story too. I'll spare you for now, but I do have one that's not quite as dramatic as yours, but somewhat.
The other nice stories about survival are in F.W. Meyer's books, the book he wrote in 1905 about psychic exploration of the dead in England. And he had cases where a deceased philosopher would be talking to somebody at the university through a medium. And it's as though they were having this detailed philosophical conversation on a long-distance phone. And speaking philosophy is just like speaking Greek, that you can't pretend to be a philosopher if you're not one. So they were having, this was Sidgwick talking to Myers, let's say, where one was dead and the other was alive, and they were able to talk about the curriculum for the next year, what should be done at Cambridge through this medium, and I found that conversation very compelling.
Yeah, there's all of these little bits of evidence, and remote viewing, or just before we started, you said there should maybe be a different name for it. Did you call it instant knowing, I think?
Direct knowing would be
direct
good.
knowing, yes. Let's talk about that, but I just think there's all of these little bits of evidence that we've acquired over many, many years that give these hints that our reality is a little bit different than what common sense, conventional wisdom tells us. And that's just yet another of these. May I ask you about Pat Price? And I'm saying this because in Third Eye Spies, Pat Price is really one of the key figures that's talked about. His story really is quite amazing. And it just seems to me that even now, like when you hear about remote viewing, people will mention your name. They'll mention Ingo Swann. They'll mention Joe McMoneagle. But Pat Price, I mean, for those in the field, yes, they all know him. But a lot of people do not know how extraordinary this man is and what he did and the manner of his death, incidentally, which I think is quite significant. And I wonder if you might talk a little bit about Pat Price and why he's so important. What was so incredible about him?
Well, Pat Price was a retired police commissioner of the city of Burbank, and he was able to describe things in the distance in great detail and make architectural, wonderful drawings of them. And he did that. We did that in a formal study. The first formal study at SRI was with Pat Price. Hal Puthoff would hide in some random location in the Bay Area, and I would sit with Price in our little shielded room and get him some coffee and try and quiet him down and ask him to describe the images that he saw. And he didn't need a contract auditor. He had been doing this all of his life. And he did excellent descriptions. So at the end of 9 trials, a psychologist who was blind to the target pool was able to match up 7 of those 9 descriptions against the true place in first place match. In English, what we would say is that if Puthoff had been kidnapped 9 days in a row, Price would have found him the first place he looked in 7 of those 9 places. That's highly unusual. Odds of 100,000 to 1.
Isn't at least one or possibly more of those instances where Price made these described where Puthoff would be before Hal Puthoff got there? Am I remembering that correctly?
That's right. In one of the later on in that same series, I didn't get the coffee on time, or Price said, we don't have to wait for him to get there. Let me just tell you where he'll be in 20 minutes, and we can get our coffee then. And he described a boat dock with the masts furled and the Chinese restaurant off to the side and grass in the middle and so forth. And indeed, they had gone to the boat dock in Redwood City.
And there's one other thing. Well, there was, and I'm seeming to remember that Hal Puthoff was with another scientist during at least one of these who was very skeptical of the phenomenon and insisted on driving and making the decisions as to where they were going to go and made several last-minute decisions to throw anyone off the trail. Is that also true?
That was in fact the boat dock trial. So they were still driving in circles through Menlo Park and Palo Alto, undecided where they were going, with the lab director at the wheel, so he couldn't be tricked. And so they were still doing loops through Palo Alto and Redwood City, and we had already done our work and gone down and get coffee. And that was a particularly excellent description.
Yeah, see, that's the thing that's just amazing about it.
Something. We then were asked by the CIA to get a person. Could you get a control person? We worked with Ingo Swann, who was a lifelong psychic. and whose life was wrapped up with psychic thing. Pat Price, who was a police commissioner, who said they could catch crooks by looking for a frightened person in Burbank. So he was a lifelong remote viewer. And Kit Greens, who was the head of the life science division at the CIA, a physician, said, "Can't you get a control subject who had never done this before?" And I asked my friend Hella Hamid, who was a Life magazine photographer, friend of our family for many, many years, a brilliant woman, artistic woman for all seasons. You could take her anywhere. She's a remarkable, brilliant, delightful woman. And she thought it would be amusing to be paid to be a psychic at SRI. That just tickled her. Of all the things she'd done in the world, she'd never been paid to be a psychic. But and she knew the words, but she didn't know it. So we would sit down and she said, "Okay, here I am, Hal's hiding someplace. What do I do? What are the moves here?" So I would have to tell her about quieting her mind and remembering to breathe and describe your mental images. And her very first trial became a landmark, famous remote viewing, was so accurate, of a pedestrian overpass, where the first words out of her mouth were about, he's standing in a place with squares within squares within squares, and that's just what this pedestrian overpass made of wire looked like.
Mm-hmm.
So we did a series of 9 with her, and Hella did even more significantly than Pat Price. That is, all of her trials were either first place or second place. And whereas Price was 1 in 100,000, our control subject Hella was 1 in a million. And that made everybody rethink what ESP is about.
That's amazing.
If the control subject turns out to be more psychic than the most psychic man in the world.
Yeah.
Now, the difference between Hella and Pat is that Pat functioned as a psychic person all the time. When we would go out to lunch, he would tell us what's going to be happening in the war in Israel, what's going to happen to President Nixon, what's going to happen in the government. So he was just a fountain of psychic information about the world. So he was, Hella had a higher score. Hella had a higher score because she was very sensitive to not saying incorrect things. So she had very parsimonious descriptions and little sketches, but Price was telling you the whole screen, what's going on, and as a result, sometimes he would include some things that were incorrect that would throw off a judge. So Price was, Hella and Ingo were unique psychics, but Price was in a class by himself.
Yeah, this is what the impression that always comes down about him. The ability to read alphanumeric information seemed to be very, very rare, but he had some ability to do that, and including at an underground NSA facility, which at Sugar Grove, West Virginia. You've talked about this in Third Eye Spies.
Yeah, the CIA was aware that Price could read documents, and the documents he wrote about, the documents he described at Sugar Grove, the name of the place was top secret. The name of the contracts that he was describing were themselves top secret. So we had a whole congressional investigation about why did we penetrate this? Why did the SRI have a bunch of psychics in California penetrate a NSA site in Virginia? So the CIA got in trouble for that, penetrating their sister organization. And we were then targeted to describe a Soviet weapons factory. We knew it was an R&D facility, and Price went on to describe a giant gantry crane that ran back and forth. As he psychically lay on a building, he could describe how this huge A-frame crane was running back and forth over his body.
Mm-hmm.
And he then drew that giant crane, which very greatly replicated the crane in the top secret CIA photograph. It was top secret because it was a satellite photograph.
I'll just point out, you cover this in the documentary, and the drawings are incredibly, remarkably close to what was later discovered several years later. It took a while, I believe, before those reconnaissance photos were made available, but they are incredibly, incredibly close.
And our reward for that is the CIA hired Price away from us and brought him to the CIA facility in Virginia. And it wasn't until I made the film and had Ken Kress on camera that I learned that what the problem was is that, in a sense, Price and I were too friendly with one another. The CIA felt that I was a believer. That is, I believed in ESP in the same sense I believed in lasers. After I'd cut a hole through a fire brick with a laser, I said, yes, lasers do seem to exist. Similarly, after working with Price for 3 years, and he had described landmarks all over the San Francisco Bay Area, including the Soviet Union, I said, yes, indeed, ESP must exist. But the problem was that the CIA was afraid of Price. The CIA is governed by the idea of secrecy, and here's a man for whom nothing was secret.
Exactly. So
they were worried that I, as an enthusiast, was working with Superman, and that scared the CIA. Not that they thought I would violate my top secret clearance, but they were just worried that Superman was on the loose with a bunch of hippies in California, and that seemed dangerous. So they brought him to Virginia to work with them, and he did a number of things, some of which are described in our film. See, the film is a unique event. That is, movies have been made about psychics talking about their experience and researchers talking about their experience, but we've never had a case where somebody has a film with the CIA is on camera saying, yes, we were polygraphed and I was there, and what Targ described really occurred just the way they show it in the film. So we really have testimonials from 2 high-level CIA operators who are on the scene and are able to say, yes, I was there when Price penetrated the Libyan embassy, and he actually got into the code room at the embassy and described what was there. That's what makes this film unique.
It's an unbelievable story.
And then 4 days later, Price was dead.
Yeah, can you please describe this? Like, his death was clearly suspicious, sure seems like murder, and the question is who did it? But if you would just please describe the manner of his death.
Well, his death is a mystery. That is, we don't know if it's murder. We knew it eventually came to pass that public data showed that Price was talking to his Scientology auditor on regular periods, describing this top secret material. And my telling you that is a matter of records, Washington Post, New York Times, and Ken Kress, because Kress's name was in this trove of material that was found at the Scientology Celebrity Center, whole file of Price revealing top secret information about what he and Kress were doing operationally at the CIA. And we learned that 2 years after Price died. What we don't know, what I don't know, is when the CIA discovered that. See, Price was a very smart guy, but he was not a trained spy, trained agent. So, and he was living 4 miles from CIA headquarters. So it seems to me, from my experience, that Price would obviously been under some kind of surveillance, telephone, mail, snooping, whatever. They're not going to leave Superman sitting out in his farmhouse doing top secret spying every day and not surveil that he's not describing this to somebody else. That's what I believe.
Right. And what came through?
That's my story.
Well, it came through in the documentary that, you know, it was very unusual, mysterious. I would say suspicious. And the thing that I had not known was this connection. I knew that there was a lot of Scientology connections with this. In fact, I'd like to ask you a follow-up on that, if you may. But if I may, but the manner of his death, there was some apparently suspicion that he might have been sharing or might have inadvertently shared information with his church.
Well, there's no doubt that he shared his information with the church, because
what was that all about?
Has now been published. And he shared
didn't know any of that.
and we know what he shared. So
why would he do that?
Well, he was a very, very devoted Scientologist, and part of his, I'm not a Scientologist, so I'm going to have to make up what I think was going on, but it's like being in the Catholic Church. Many people go to confessions several times a week, and I think that his relationship with his auditor was like a confession, that he was doing some very peculiar thing. Scientology is quite interested in psychic abilities. L. Ron Hubbard talked about that from the beginning in Dianetics. So and Price was a high-level Scientologist, and they were aware of his abilities, and it would be natural within their protocol for him to regularly debrief his Scientology auditor about this divine activity that he was doing.
Superman became a security risk. That was a big problem. Yeah. Amazing. His work was extraordinary.
They were aware that Price could read stuff. So what was in the air is, does that mean that a remote viewer like Price could read the launch codes for nuclear missiles from the card that the president holds? And
the answer could be yes, I would think, for someone like him.
Our overriding feeling is that a experienced remote viewer can answer any question that has an answer.
It's amazing. And actually, you've said that
a remote viewer can't tell you about God or the nature of consciousness filling the universe, but if there's some physical thing in space-time, the viewer can tell you about it.
Well, we got about 10 minutes before this segment ends, Russell, and I just wonder, while we're on this, there's lots of folks out there, so many who will
say that he might also have been, Price also might have been killed by the Russians, who were aware what he was doing.
Sure.
Or he might have had a heart attack, although when I was working with him, I thought he was an old man because he was in his mid-50s. But I'm now 30 years older than Price, and he doesn't seem so old anymore. So his dying of a heart attack from where I'm sitting becomes less likely. That is, he was not obviously sick. He was known to, quote, have a heart condition, but it didn't interfere with his having a Coke and a piece of pie for lunch every day.
Yeah.
And keeping his active schedule with us.
Was he cremated before his wife learned of his death? If I wasn't paying attention carefully in Third Eye Spies, I thought that I heard that, but did I get that wrong?
Well, that's a very sensitive question. No, you did not hear it wrong.
All right.
And I did not cue you to ask me that question. But as a matter of fact, Price was not cremated at all, in spite of the fact that it says in the film that he was, because Hal Puthoff and I went to his memorial funeral at the Scientology Center in Los Angeles, and Price was in an open casket, which I had never seen before, but he was sitting here in a nice suit looking just fine, absolutely not cremated. And he was buried in a cemetery in West LA.
Okay. Russell, if you want, I'll eliminate that question.
No, that's okay. That's an interesting.
All right.
I'm here to tell the truth. That's a mystery.
Well, I asked because it was raised in the documentary itself, and I just figured it would be fair to ask about it.
Well,
It seemed a little sketchy the way that his.
Ken Kress says that he was cremated before his wife knew about it.
Right.
To the best of my knowledge, he was not cremated at all.
All right.
So that's just another mystery.
Well, thanks for clearing that up, honestly. We've got only about less than 10 minutes for this segment. And I want to ask you, I'm going to go back to the process of remote viewing. There's so many of these stories. I mean, there's Patty Hearst, and there's the plane that was recovered during the Carter administration in Africa, and all of these. There's Joe McMoneagle's stories, which are prominent in the documentary as well. But I would like to ask you, relating to the technique of remote viewing. So, for example, these days, because remote viewing it's such a buzzword, it's out there everywhere, and everyone is a remote viewer. And it's not that, I mean, everyone does. I believe you when you say everyone's got some psychic ability. But maybe that doesn't make everyone a proficient remote viewer. And there's lots of folks who will say, oh, yes, I remote view this, I remote view that, I remote view that. And it just seems like a bit of a stretch to me, because the way that you've described the process of remote viewing, your conscious intention has to be pretty much out of the picture, right? I mean, you've got to have a blind remote viewer in the sense that they don't know what is being targeted. And indeed, the person leading them through it, which often that was you, was also blind to the targets. And so that the point that you've often stressed is the person doing the remote viewing has got to have no guessing, no analytical anything. Like you can't put your conscious decisions in the process, or you'll just find a way to screw it up. And that's really important, isn't it?
And it's important. That's correct. And it's important to know that this is not New Age. Over my shoulder here in my room is a picture of Padmasambhava, who is a historical Buddhist who brought Buddhism from India to Tibet. Padmasambhava invented Tibetan Buddhism, is a historical character from the 800s. And he wrote a very nice book on this subject called Self-Liberation Through Seeing with Naked Awareness. And he said, your nature is naked awareness. And if you can quiet your mind and give up guessing and naming, you can experience everything in the universe, both time and space. And because your mind is outside of time, there is no cause and effect, no limitations on consciousness. So this was completely understood in the 800s. So this is not New Age. As Padmasambhava taught this is part of the teaching of Dzogchen Buddhism, that timeless awareness is our nature. You've got to stop what Buddhism accomplishes is they give you training to find the off switch for the ongoing chatter. So the first step in remote viewing is to get quiet, and some people simply can't do that. Mm-hmm. If you have an interviewer working with you, that's a big help, because I can convince a person just to breathe, close your eyes, and now tell me about the surprising images that come into your awareness. And it's like a hypnotic induction.
Right, exactly. A better way, just like hypnosis.
Person, we've done this for a decade at SRI. Just trust me for 10 minutes here and just keep quiet and tell me what shows up in your awareness. And I promise not to hurt you, and something interesting might happen.
Indeed. Do you find a lot of pushback to this day from people who are committed skeptics on the subject of remote viewing, or has there been a change over the decades? But do you still get a lot of these skeptical people who just think it's all hocus pocus, magician's tricks, or something like that?
There are skeptics, but they don't talk to me. I have not had any. See, I come across, as I mentioned before, as though I'm talking about lasers. When when the Navy came to my laser lab and I had a 1,000-watt laser in a little package, they didn't believe me. They said, "How do we know those meters are real?" And I say, "Here you are. I've just burned a hole through a fire brick. Look at that, and you decide." Well, that's the way I feel about psychic abilities. I'm not kidding around. I'm not selling you statistics. If you want to see something psychic, I'm not going to show you what the psychic does. I will simply show the skeptic how to do it. And I've done that with government scientists right up to the Undersecretary of Defense, who came to our lab, wanted to see something psychic, and I sat him down and said, "Hal will go someplace with your adjutant. I have no idea where he is, of course, and I just want you to make a little sketch of where they've gone." And he made a wonderful drawing of a art institute in another city, wonderful patio with a fountain and bricks and so forth. And he just drew the whole thing. He said, "That's amazing. That picture just, I have no idea what that is, but that just showed up in my consciousness." And I said, "Well, that's what we're teaching."
This was an Undersecretary of Defense?
Yeah, Walter LaBerge.
Oh, yes.
He showed
early 1980s, I believe he was in that capacity. Am I remembering correctly?
Well, it's a funny story. This was at the early 80s, and then LaBerge and I quit doing psychic spy and both went to work for Lockheed. He came in as head of research, and I came in as a researcher putting lasers on airplanes. I was still doing remote sensing, but I was remote sensing wind shear and air turbulence.
Hey, in the final couple of minutes here, would you care to discuss your idea of total knowing, I think is what you called it, as opposed to remote viewing? Why do you...
knowing.
Yeah.
Well, the problem with the name remote, it's sort of an inside baseball argument. The problem with the name remote viewing is, first of all, we don't think it's remote. You can't see Jupiter because Jupiter is outside your light cone, 500 million miles away. So that doesn't make any sense. It must be, and what the Buddhists say throughout the teaching is that they obviously don't have a explanation of the 8-space manifold, but they say there's no separation. So the experienced remote viewer, person who lives as a psychic functioning person, notices that there's no separation between him and anything else in the universe. And that corresponds to my experience that I'm having increasingly. I had very good success for a decade, anomalously good. I had as much success with 6 Army officers from Fort Meade as we had with many other people. That is, we had 6 Army officers, and 4 of them were independently statistically significant, went back to Fort Meade and led the cadre of psychic remote viewers.
Yeah.
And those guys all did very, very well. One of those was Joe McMoneagle, who did exceptionally well. And he had the advantage that he was skilled as a mechanical draftsman. So if he saw a building, he could say, and he did this, he described the Lawrence Livermore Laboratory, our own atomic bomb factory, where the CIA was hiding for that day. And Joe was able to say, "I think he's at a 6-story building shaped like a letter T and covered with glass. Let me draw that." And he made a perfectly accurate architectural drawing of a 6-story sheet, hard to say, a 6-story T-shaped building covered with glass, and we have a photograph that exactly replicates what Joe drew. So we're talking about psychic functioning at a very high level. That is Joe's drawing of Lawrence Livermore, we show side by side with the photograph, and it's as though you had a draftsman looking at the photograph making a drawing of this very complicated place.
So there's viewing involved, but there's a lot of other types of knowing involved, and this is a lot more. I mean, in McMonagle's case, it seems like he was actually very skilled at seeing things, but this is a
including
process.
The future. He would often go to Japan and do. I don't know if this is well, since our subtext is no more secret, no more secrets. What Joe has often told me about is trips to Japan where he is jet lagged, and his shtick that he did for a decade would show up on a Japanese TV show that adored him. And what they would do is somebody from the audience would be taken to some obscure hiding place in Tokyo. And Tokyo is full of weird places, unusual shapes and so forth. And Joe's job was to sit quietly and make a drawing of where the person was kidnapped to. As we say in the magic business, that's the effect. That's what the audience saw. What really happened is when Joe came to Tokyo, he would get some rest and then sit down in his hotel and make a drawing of where the person would be taken at a later time when he came to the studio, because it was much easier to draw this place in the quiet of his hotel room than in the studio. And the fact that he was doing it 10 hours in advance in no way interfered with his accuracy. So in our model, we say that this is a non-local ability. It's independent of space and time.
Just throw time right out the window, because everything that I ever thought that I knew about time just got debunked by remote viewing. And the more you look into it, the more time just seems like I have to admit, I don't really know how to understand time anymore, because it's stories like this. And where does that leave free will? And you know what I mean? Like, if he's able to see something 10 hours before it happens, does that mean that we're just playing through a tape that's already been recorded for us?
Well, you know that we did forecasting of silver commodities in 1982. I was working with another psychic and a broker, and each week for 9 weeks, we made a forecast whether silver would go up a little or up a lot, down a little or down a lot. And our viewer was correct in that 1 in 4 game 9 times in a row. And we made 120,000 real dollars back when that was actually significant money.
Not too bad. Look, Russell, there's a lot more that we can be discussing here. In fact, I'm going to wrap this segment up and we'll just continue. But this concludes this segment of my interview with the legendary Russell Targ. And Russell, I just want to thank you for your participation in this chat here today. You've been amazing.
Very, very happy to chat with you. Thank you.
So for those of you who want to hear Russell and I continue, please go to my website, richarddolanmembers.com, where Russell and I are going to go even further. Thanks for listening. And just remember, while we learn and grow and search for the truth, let's be good to each other. Later.